Okay, now this is a way of getting to Chikake's second thesis, which is the interaction of psychological needs, ideology, and economic interest function dynamically in the English settlement of the United States. I think that's on page 11 of my version of it. I think that's right. Let's start off with this notion. This was supposed to be a country which, in their ideology, in their belief system, each person had to be in charge of themselves, and yet they were run by a king who would not allow their industries to flourish. And so the Revolutionary War is sort of built on a foundation of we have to be in control of our own country. We can't let a king who doesn't work himself and isn't productive and has myriad luxuries rule us, or we are surely going to hell. This is sort of the way they built themselves up into taking on, which was a fairly awesome task. But again, that notion of being in control of themselves, not having a master, and trying to separate themselves from luxury and sin was what they were trying to do. The war was built on a separation from sin, evidenced in the king and the luxuries and power that... Okay, so they were trying to get away from the king, and the Revolutionary War was built upon this notion of being separate from sin. It all sounds great, and they sound like great people, although nobody would want to party with them. But were they really without sin? I mean, the thing is they were, if you take what Chikake's saying seriously, they are sincere, they're believers. If they see any sin in themselves, there's so few seats in heaven. They're just not worthy. What do you do in that situation if you do see sin in yourself? So here's an example. Little Johnny Puritan's walking down the street. He sees little Mary Puritan, and she's looking good. And, he has some physical evidence on his own body that he is sexually excited by her. Well, that sexual excitement does not seem particularly godly. It seems rather sinful, and it's connected to his body. Now, that looks like somebody that is not going to heaven. What do you do? Well, if you're Johnny, one of the things you might do is this. You might realize that this happens to you every time you see Mary. I think this is probably Mary's sin that she thrusts upon you. She brings out this sexuality in you just by the way that she looks and acts. It's really, if you think about it, her sexuality, because when she's not there, you're not feeling it. Then the question is, well, what do you do now? What you have to do is you have to control Mary and her sexuality. One of the great ways to do this, of course, is marriage. If you marry her, then you can control, that unbridled, hysterical, emotional, sinful sexuality that women have. Okay, look, this is not my trip. I'm just saying, at the time, they would have seen men as rational beings who could control themselves. They would not have seen women as rational beings who could control themselves. Their sexism, not mine, just trying to describe it. More importantly here, well, they're both actually important. One, because women aren't seen as inherently rational, you can always see a sin, even if it looks like it's on your body, as coming from them. And then the idea is that you have to, the first idea is that you project that sin onto them, where it's not your sin, it's their sin. And then the question is, how do you control their sinful sexuality? Not how do you control your own sinful sexuality? That sort of projection is what's necessary if you're going to feel secure about your position relative to heaven, if you're going to believe that you have to be sin-free to be good enough to make it, then whatever comes up in you has to be projected onto someone else. Every insecurity you feel about yourself has to be pushed onto someone else. You have to be Republican and ascetic. You have to be productive, and through grace and works show your worthiness through God. Every time that sin comes up, it's got to be pushed onto that other, or those others. They are sinful. They are controlled by their bodies, their sexuality, their gluttony, their pride, their drunkenness, their laziness. It's theirs. Even their sickness, which can't even be yours. That has to be pushed out from you. And that's how you deal with the sins that you find in yourself, is a projection. In effect, you can begin to understand this group that would become the dominant force in American politics, that later on we will talk about as whites, although actually maybe not too much later. And I don't mean whites as a physical group or in terms of physical features or even now what you think of as white. I'm just saying that there's a coming time where they're going to talk about themselves as whites. And all the others are going to be of the body, of sin, of luxury. This is a political move, an ideological move, a purifying move, and a religious move. That's what's being done here as you separate yourselves from luxury. Okay, back to thesis 2. The interaction of psychological needs, ideology, and economic interest function dynamically in the English settlement of America, again from page 11 of Takaki. Alright, so breaking it down. Economically, in the northeast of this country, they were dominated by England. They badly needed labor, and no labor wanted to come. And they had to be productive as a practical matter, or else they were going to die. And a lot of the establishments have died. Takaki will give you a lot more detail on that. Secondly, psychologically, they needed to have an identity that was not land-based exactly, because they weren't from the land, they weren't from here. A lot of ethnic groups are connected to the land that they grew up in. But when you migrate to a place and have to take over, and take the example of South Africa, for example, you need a new story, something that connects you with the place that you are. Psychologically, they also needed to believe that they were good people, regardless of what they were doing. And they needed to feel that they would not enslave, exploit, or degrade people. That's part of meaning that they're good. By their own devices, given their own choice, that they wouldn't. Ideologically, and I'm sometimes confused about where Takaki wants to stop psychology and ideology, and I take it it's at the movement of political acts, but I'm uncertain. Ideologically, they had to believe that blacks and Indians were deserving of the treatments that they were getting and about to get. And they had to believe that their own actions were God's plan. So, saying it again, the interaction of their psychological needs, their belief system, their ideology, and their economic interests functioned dynamically, just meaning that each one informed the other and they worked together in the English settlement of the United States.